Imagine building one of the biggest restaurant chains in America, only to watch it collapse in less than 2 decades. Quiznos went from about 4,700 stores at its peak in 2007 to roughly 150 U.S. locations in 2025. It's not just a story about sandwiches, it's about predatory contracts, overpriced supply chains, and debt traps that crushed small business owners. We'll show you how corporate decisions can wipe out both an empire and the franchisees who staked everything on it, and what to avoid if you're ever considering buying into a franchise. To understand how it all began, we need to go back to Denver in 1981. From Denver Deli to Toasted Giant. In Denver, 2 local restaurateurs, Jimmy Lambatos and Todd Disner, experimented with a small deli idea that would become the hallmark of their legacy. In 1981, they opened the first Quiznos shop, serving Italian-inspired sandwiches, but with one twist no other chain had made standard. Every sub went through a conveyor-style toaster before it reached the customer. The sandwiches weren't gourmet, but that single step changed how they tasted. Warm bread, melted cheese, and a texture that pulled everything together set them apart from fast food competitors whose meals often arrived cold and flat. That innovation gave Quiznos a clear identity from day one, and it caught on quickly with Denver locals. The timing worked in their favor. During the 1980s, Americans were embracing fast food with more enthusiasm than ever. Chains like Subway and McDonald's were expanding aggressively, filling malls and shopping centers across the country. Quiznos distinguished itself in that same landscape by offering a product that felt slightly elevated without sacrificing speed or price. Customers liked that it wasn't just a quick sandwich. It was hot, indulgent, and more substantial than what they could get from the competition. That one oven set the stage, but it also drew attention from much bigger players. Through the late 80s and into the early 90s, Quiznos expanded with deliberate steps. Small business owners bought into the brand, opening new stores in suburban strip malls and office-heavy neighborhoods. The pitch was consistent. You could serve sandwiches that felt more premium than standard fast food, priced just high enough to signal quality, but not so high that they scared off weekday lunch crowds. Locations leaned into the upscale quick service image. Shops highlighted the toasting process, displayed thicker cuts of meat compared to industry norms, and offered soups and sides that made lunch feel more like a satisfying meal than a snack. This approach resonated with busy professionals who wanted something quick, but better than a burger and fries. By the time the brand reached beyond Colorado, Quiznos had carved out a loyal customer base that viewed it as a higher-end alternative in the fast food world. For many, it became the go-to option when they wanted more than Subway's cold simplicity. The pace of growth accelerated noticeably in the 1990s. While many restaurant chains take decades to scale into the thousands, Quiznos hit a trajectory that looked more like a rocket. Less than 2 decades after that first Denver shop, Quiznos had expanded to nearly 4,700 stores worldwide. In an era before smartphones, delivery apps, and social media-driven food trends, that kind of expansion seemed almost unbelievable. Their rise suggested that, with the right franchise partners and enough momentum, they might eventually rival Subway directly. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Quiznos was not simply a new sandwich chain. It was positioning itself as Subway's first real national competitor. Subway's core identity relied on fresh ingredients and a lighter, better-for-you image. Quiznos countered with indulgence, sandwiches overflowing with melted cheese, hearty bread, and rich dressings. The contrast worked. People who found Subway bland gravitated toward Quiznos, seeing it as the more flavorful and filling option. That perception fueled the rapid spread of new franchises, and with every additional storefront, the company looked more formidable. The franchising boom owed much to timing. Aspiring entrepreneurs looking to enter the fast food market often saw Subway as overcrowded. Quiznos, by comparison, was fresh, fast-growing, and still absent in many regions. Potential franchisees were sold on both differentiation, the unique toasted product, and opportunity. Subway's size didn't leave room for new operators in many areas, but Quiznos looked like the brand where you could get in early and ride a wave of growth. This pitch brought in droves of franchise owners and pushed expansion at a speed few chains had ever matched. On the customer-facing side, the marketing reinforced this edge. Advertisements focused relentlessly on visuals of sandwiches pulled from ovens, steam rising, and melted cheese stretching. Quiznos wasn't trying to sell novelty. It was selling sensory appeal that, competitors hadn't made standard yet. Even major fast food names like McDonald's and Burger King tried to mimic this by showcasing melted cheese in their campaigns, but they couldn't replicate the way Quiznos built its entire brand identity around that appeal. By the mid-2000s, Quiznos had cemented its place in the minds of the public. For people walking through malls or downtown centers, it wasn't unusual to see a Subway on one corner and a Quiznos just across the street. Fans of the toasted subs rarely hesitated, believing that Quiznos was the better option. Its servings looked bigger, tasted richer, and felt more satisfying than Subway's pared-down offerings. During these years, industry analysts speculated openly about whether Quiznos could one day surpass Subway as the leader in fast subs. The brand's identity had been established with remarkable clarity. One idea, toasted subs, defined it entirely. Unlike chains that leaned on mascots, slogans, or varied menus, Quiznos built a reputation on one improvement to an old standard. It wasn't reinventing the sandwich, but elevating it just enough. That message proved powerful, convincing countless customers that Quiznos offered a better version of something they already knew. By scaling this message through thousands of new stores, they seemed poised for long-term dominance. Yet momentum carried hidden issues. Subway, though still slower growing in perception, followed a deliberate model that spread risk across a more stable framework. Quiznos, in contrast, sprinted toward growth without the same tested foundation. The numbers looked impressive, nearly 5,000 stores on the map, a respected brand reputation, and market buzz suggesting they had cracked Subway's dominance. But those numbers disguised cracks in the very system driving their rise. And just as Quiznos reached its peak, a new problem appeared. In 2005, Subway added toasters to every store. Overnight, Quiznos lost the exclusivity of its signature feature. The one thing their brand had built its reputation on was suddenly available at their largest competitor, at a lower price point and in far more locations. That single shift immediately raised deeper questions about how Quiznos was structured. Because while customers still enjoyed the food and franchise operators still believed in the promise of growth, the foundation beneath the company was about to change hands. And with that shift, the path forward would look very different. The franchise gold rush. When new ownership took over in the early 1990s, Quiznos began pursuing growth with a very different mindset. Founder Jimmy Lambatos sold the company in 1991 to franchisee Rick Shadden and his father, who already operated several Quiznos shops. Under the Shaddens, the chain pivoted away from slow, organic progress and instead pushed aggressively into franchising. The model was no longer about building a handful of strong stores. It was about multiplying locations on a massive scale. The reasoning seemed straightforward. Subway had risen to power by selling thousands of franchise licenses, so the Shaddens believed Quiznos could do the same, just faster. They weren't trying to reinvent the restaurant. It was about selling the opportunity to operate one. That strategy paid off at first. The company went public in 1994, and the surge in investor confidence added fuel to expansion. By 2007, Quiznos had reached about 4,700 US locations at its peak, a breathtaking climb in less than 2 decades. Potential operators saw these numbers and lined up. For many small business hopefuls, owning a Quiznos appeared safer than starting an independent restaurant. Brand recognition, national ads, and the promise of toasted subs made the pitch persuasive. At expos and in marketing materials, Quiznos presented itself as the next Subway, the one chance to secure a stake before territories filled up. For people sitting on retirement funds or home equity, it looked like a short path into the American dream of entrepreneurship. But the way the system was designed revealed a flaw. In a healthy franchise model, both corporate and franchisees win only if the restaurants thrive. Revenue is tied to customer loyalty and long-term sales. At Quiznos, the incentives didn't line up that way. The company made its money up front, franchise fees, royalties, and more importantly, through the supplies every store was obligated to purchase from distributors tied to headquarters. That meant corporate profits flowed whether or not an individual store survived. So while operators carried the risks of rising rent, payroll, and local competition, Quiznos still collected from them at every step. This design changed what kind of company Quiznos really was. Instead of focusing on support systems, better training, advertising networks, or regional marketing, headquarters funneled energy into selling more contracts. The customer, they prioritized wasn't the person walking up to order a sandwich, but the franchisee willing to pay to open a store. On paper, each new contract meant growth. In practice, operators were left scrambling without much help once the doors actually opened. Early adopters still had reason to believe. Some locations launched strong, with lines out the door and crowded lunch rushes. Those success stories got published, shared, and promoted, keeping demand high. Enthusiasm built on itself. Each new franchisee thought they were part of a gold rush, stepping into a chain poised to dominate. And in those first few years, it looked as if many of them were right. But growth at that pace creates pressure points. As more stores opened, they began competing not just with Subway or local delis, but with one another. Corporate often allowed multiple Quiznos to open within the same neighborhood, sometimes within blocks. From headquarters' perspective, this wasn't a problem. Every store meant another round of fees. But on the ground, franchisees saw their sales divided by oversaturation. Their main rival wasn't across town. It was often just across the street. The financial structure only made this harder. Franchisees paid to join, paid monthly royalties, and paid inflated prices for food and paper goods from the corporate-controlled distributor. Even when demand was strong, margins were thin. A location could serve steady crowds and still struggle to turn consistent profit once all those layers of fees were subtracted. Some operators worked long hours without paying themselves, convinced the brand's growth meant their sacrifice would pay off. Others quickly saw that survival was precarious. This churn was built into the model. When stores closed, corporate didn't lose money. In fact, a failed location often created the chance to resell that territory to someone new. The failure of one operator became the opportunity for another to sign on. That cycle looked like growth on a chart, but masked the instability underneath. And as word spread among franchisees that operating a store was tougher than it looked, the optimism that had driven the boom began to sour. It was a paradox. From the outside, Quiznos looked unstoppable by the early 2000s. The toasted sandwich had gone from a quirky add-on to a nationwide trend, and Subway had been forced to respond by installing ovens of its own. For customers, this was proof of Quiznos' influence. For investors and potential operators, thousands of locations seemed to signal trustworthiness. But inside, the realities were stark, operators facing astronomical costs, internal competition, and little corporate backing. The gold rush period captured both the promise and the danger of Quiznos' rise. Entrepreneurs flooded in, hoping to build prosperity off a recognizable name. But the way the system was structured meant those hopes often collided with debt and disillusionment. Growth was undeniable. Stability was not. And while many believed they were joining an empire in its prime, they were instead stepping into a machine designed to extract value from them rather than secure their success. By the middle of the decade, maps of US locations looked impressive, with Quiznos seemingly on every corner. The chart of expansion was steep, the ads were everywhere, and to customers, the brand still looked vibrant. Yet beneath that image, the strain on owners was growing heavier. Every new franchise contract added to the appearance of strength, but also to the fragility of the system. That flaw wasn't just about too many stores or lofty fees. It went deeper, into the very way that Quiznos made its money. At the core of the model was a dependence on mandatory supply purchases, a system that kept headquarters profitable no matter how each store performed. That arrangement is what would transform Quiznos from a restaurant chain focused on subs into something far different, and far more damaging to the people who bought into it. The supply chain trap. Quiznos' entire structure leaned on one financial mechanism that worked well for corporate, but crushed the stores trying to operate under it. At the center was the supply chain deal every franchisee was required to accept. No owner could shop around, negotiate, or source locally. Everything, ingredients, packaging, even paper napkins, had to flow through American food distributors, a company tied directly to Quiznos corporate. On the surface, this was presented as a way to keep standards consistent. In practice, it locked operators into inflated costs from day one. Because there was no freedom to buy elsewhere, margins were worse before a store even opened its doors. A nearby deli could buy produce and meats at wholesale prices, while a Quiznos owner was forced to pay significantly higher rates, even for basic items. Selling sandwiches for $6 or $7 didn't guarantee profit. It often just covered the overhead tied to headquarters. No matter how many customers came through, the math tilted against the franchisee. This model reversed what franchising is supposed to deliver. Normally, operators pay royalties in exchange for clear benefits: marketing assistance, strong branding, and access to bulk supply discounts negotiated at scale. Instead, Quiznos stripped out the benefits that would have helped owners stay competitive. Not only did they owe royalties on sales, but they also watched extra dollars stripped away through markups on distribution. Corporate collected revenue whether a store thrived or failed. For owners, there was no practical route to improve the situation. Costs were fixed by contract. Flexibility didn't exist. Even weeks with strong sales couldn't offset ingredients priced higher than industry norms. The squeeze was felt daily, and the perception among customers made it worse. Subway, with a more optimized supply chain, could sell sandwiches at a lower price point. To many buyers comparing menus side by side, Quiznos began to look expensive. That impression wasn't caused by local greed. It was built into the structure of the business itself. As the franchise count expanded, the pressure on suppliers and the leverage against operators only grew. Instead of using scale to negotiate better costs on behalf of owners, the parent company leaned harder into the system of inflating prices through its distribution arm. Each tomato, loaf of bread, or box of napkins transferred money back to headquarters instead of staying in the store. For operators, it meant that no matter how well they performed, they were always sending more cash upstream than competitors in the same market. Court filings and later reporting revealed the scale. At its peak, the distribution operation tied to Quiznos generated hundreds of millions of dollars annually. That wasn't revenue from selling sandwiches. It was money pulled from the franchise network itself. The financial consequences were visible in the fundamentals. A single Quiznos store might gross several $100,000 per year. But after royalties, high supply costs, payroll, and rent, the supposed profit margin could evaporate. What should have provided a decent salary for an owner often turned into debt or unpaid bills. The outcome wasn't reinvestment in staff or equipment. It was corners being cut in desperation. Behind the counter, the impact was clear. Many franchisees couldn't afford enough workers during peak hours, so service slowed. Training was thin because extra payroll wasn't possible. Equipment broke and went unrepaired, leaving ovens unreliable or refrigeration inconsistent. Standards slipped not because owners didn't care, but because there wasn't enough cash to maintain them. Customers who once expected Quiznos to feel like a higher-end alternative encountered stores that looked underfunded and poorly maintained. At that point, Quiznos wasn't operating like a traditional restaurant chain. Each storefront was effectively a distribution outlet, a channel through which supplies flowed, regardless of how the store itself performed. If a location was busy, corporate profited both on royalties and on supplies. If it was slow, corporate still profited at least once. For franchisees, there was no equivalent upside, only the possibility of keeping their head above water for another year. Owners tried to adapt. Some raised prices to cover the inflated costs, hoping loyal customers would stick with them. But a sandwich $1 or $2 higher than the equivalent Subway or Jersey Mike's Choice gave many people pause. Head-to-head in the same strip mall or food court, Quiznos carried the burden of higher menu prices, a direct result of headquarters' supply chain model. Even with food quality on their side, higher pricing in a competitive market drove customers away. Franchisees grew frustrated and, eventually, combative. Lawsuits claimed that the arrangement made profitability impossible. Operators alleged they had no genuine path to sustain themselves, regardless of effort. Unlike systems that seek long-term partnerships with owners, Quiznos appeared to treat each signed contract as the true sale. If one owner failed, corporate could find another to take the spot, restart the store, and continue feeding the supply operation. The risk stayed fully with the operator. The imbalance became visible in lending statistics, too. Analysis of SBA-backed loans later compared success rates across restaurant franchises. Quiznos franchisees showed default rates many times higher than Subway's, evidence that these stores weren't just unlucky, but were systematically disadvantaged. For lenders, it was a warning sign. For families that had sunk their retirement funds or mortgages into stores, it was devastation. Those who stepped into ownership often did so imagining they were buying independence. In reality, many discovered they had entered into a rigid arrangement closer to indenture. They worked exhausting hours, invested personal savings, and still watched most of the profits siphoned away too. cover fees, and overpriced supplies. Success stories existed but were rare, and even they faced constant financial strain. By the mid-2000s, this reputation had spread widely among franchise operators. Quiznos was no longer seen primarily as a symbol of growth and opportunity. Instead, it was viewed as a system tilted toward corporate enrichment at the expense of local success. The toasted sandwiches still appealed to customers, but the aura of a partnership-driven franchise had been stripped away. More and more, the brand was remembered for trapping owners in a business that took more than it gave back. That shift eroded trust not only between corporate and franchisees, but also between the public image and the internal reality. On the outside, Quiznos advertised innovation and indulgence. Behind the counters, operators ran on slim margins, cut costs wherever possible, and hoped the next month wouldn't end in closure. This was the stage when Quiznos passed from being a growing challenger to a struggling brand weighed down by its own systems. While customers continued to enjoy their toasted subs, competing chains found ways to expand without forcing owners into the same kind of fixed losses. The survival of Quiznos stores hinged on a business model that often left owners hanging on by a thread, while rivals were building on steadier ground. Competitors play it smarter. While Quiznos locked itself into a high-cost system that drained operators, its competitors were laying out strategies built to last. Jimmy John's, Jersey Mike's, and Firehouse subs all grew in the same fast-casual surge of the late 1990s and early 2000s, often battling for the same lunch crowds. But unlike Quiznos, they avoided burning their partners out with inflated expenses or reckless expansion. Their choices underline the difference between chasing quick wins and building foundations that can carry a chain decades into the future. Jimmy John's is the clearest example. While Quiznos stretched its identity around ovens, variety, and heavily marketed premium offerings, Jimmy John's stripped the idea of a sandwich down to its simplest moving parts. Bread, meat, cheese, basic toppings, assembled quickly, delivered even faster. The menu barely changed for years, avoiding the trap of constant limited-time experiments. Because workers didn't need specialized training to run kitchen equipment or execute complex recipes, stores could hire and scale staff easily. Lower overhead, fast service, and predictability for customers all reinforced the same advantage: stability. Stores opened slower than Quiznos, but the model gave franchisees actual margin to survive, which meant fewer failures. Jersey Mike's chose another path, grounding its appeal in visible quality. Their standout became the hand-slicing of meats and cheeses behind the counter, something every customer could see. It was theater that doubled as proof of freshness. Just as important, corporate growth was steady and intentional. Locations weren't piled on top of each other in crowded markets, and franchisees were supported with tools to market locally. The national image grew from the strength of individual operators rather than sheer numbers on a map. That gave Jersey Mike's consistency and a reputation for treating owners as partners, not disposable contract holders. Firehouse subs leaned into identity on a different axis: community and hospitality. Founded by former firefighters, the chain tied its sandwiches to public service. A portion of sales funded initiatives for fire departments and safety programs. That narrative gave customers a reason to choose Firehouse that went beyond food. It also reduced the marketing burden on individual operators since the cause-driven message resonated widely. With corporate absorbing much of the promotional lift and operators shielded from excessive supply markups, franchisees had breathing room. Their sandwiches weren't significantly cheaper, but the goodwill and strong story converted into long-term customer loyalty that Quiznos never translated. Compared against Quiznos, these approaches appear almost cautious. Yet that caution paid off when external factors shifted. Subway, still the largest by far, added toasters across its system in 2005. Overnight, Quiznos lost the one feature that had set it apart. Then in 2008, Subway released the $5 footlong promotion, undercutting an already price-squeezed Quiznos with an offering millions of Americans immediately understood. Neither Jimmy John's nor Jersey Mike's competed on toastiness or bargain gimmicks. Their differentiation rested on speed, quality, or values. That decision insulated them from being erased by Subway's moves, while Quiznos' fragile identity was left exposed. The essence of these differences comes down to how each chain treated its operators. Quiznos saw them as revenue streams locked into mandatory supply purchases. Competitors structured their systems to be manageable for franchisees. Jimmy John's simple menu limited training costs and food waste. Jersey Mike's deliberately controlled expansion to prevent locations from siphoning sales from one another. Firehouse baked a loyalty hook into the brand that carried weight at the community level. These weren't just marketing slogans, they were deliberate design choices that allowed stores to survive downturns and recession cycles. The impacts were visible to customers even if they didn't know the behind-the-scenes structures. Walking into a Jimmy John's, ordering felt effortless, fast enough to guarantee lunchtime convenience. Jersey Mike's came across as fresh and human, with visible slicing and more attention at the counter. Firehouse stood as hearty food wrapped in a charitable story. In comparison, Quiznos' strongest asset, hot sandwiches, wasn't enough. Customers experienced inconsistent service, unreliable availability as more stores shuttered, and menu prices that looked inflated relative to both Subway and rivals. Those impressions stick, and once loyalty erodes, it rarely returns.